There is a quiet irony sitting in most modern kitchens today. Shelves stocked with expensive supplements lined up in neat rows, pill organizers arranged like little soldiers, medicine cabinets overflowing with bottles that cost a fortune and come with a page of side effects printed in letters so small you need a magnifying glass just to read them. And yet, tucked quietly into the back of a refrigerator somewhere, or sitting forgotten on a counter in a mason jar that is slowly bubbling away. There is something that ancient civilizations considered more valuable than gold itself. Something that required no laboratory, no corporate patent, no doctor's prescription. Just salt, time, and the quiet intelligence of the living world. While the modern food industry spent the last 100 years perfecting the art of killing food, pasteurizing it into submission, sterilizing it into blandness, and processing it into something that can sit on a shelf for 3 years. Without changing a single molecule, the ancient world was doing the exact opposite. They were keeping food alive. And the gut bacteria, the enzymes, the organic acids, and the bioactive compounds inside that living food were keeping them alive in return. Today, we are counting down 15 fermented foods from ancient tradition that modern science is now scrambling to fully understand, decades behind the wisdom that built them. Pay close attention to number 1, because most people reading this have had it sitting in their kitchen for years and never once realized it was doing anything at all. And when we get to number 8, I am going to tell you the story of a healing recorded in one of the oldest texts in human history, a story that when you read it through the lens of modern biochemistry stops looking like poetry and starts looking like a precise clinical description of cellular restoration. If you have ever wanted to understand what your gut is actually begging for, what your cells are quietly crying out for, what your ancestors knew that we have somehow forgotten, this is that conversation. Stay with me until the end, because the final principle I leave you with changes how you look at every food label you will ever read again. Number 15. Sauerkraut, the probiotic that crossed oceans. In the book of Numbers, the Israelites wandering through the wilderness are recorded as having carried preserved salted food for survival over extended desert journeys. Salt-preserved fermented vegetation was not a modern invention. It was ancient survival technology, refined over thousands of years. The specific chemistry behind why it worked was not understood then, but it was practiced across virtually every civilization that ever needed to keep food alive through a long season of scarcity. The Chinese were fermenting cabbage and rice wine over 2,000 years ago to feed the laborers building the Great Wall. Roman legions carried fermented cabbage on their campaigns, and German sailors, centuries before James Cook famously used citrus, were preventing scurvy at sea with barrels of sauerkraut, a fact documented in the journals of Captain James Cook himself, who credited the practice with keeping his entire crew alive during extended Pacific voyages. What those cultures preserved without knowing the mechanism is something modern science can now describe precisely. Raw, unpasteurized sauerkraut, produced through lacto-fermentation, contains lactobacillus bacteria in counts that can reach into the billions per serving. It contains vitamin C, enough historically to prevent scurvy on months-long ocean voyages. It contains vitamin K2, glucosinolates from the cabbage, with documented activity in laboratory cancer research, and organic acids that studies suggest directly reduce inflammation in the gut lining. A landmark Stanford University study found that a diet high in fermented foods increased microbiome diversity more effectively than even a high-fiber diet. A result that surprised researchers who had long assumed fiber was the primary driver of gut health. Here is the preparation detail that matters most and that most people completely miss. The sauerkraut sitting in the grocery store aisle in a can or a sealed shelf-stable jar has been pasteurized. The heat that makes it shelf-stable kills every single live culture it ever contained. What you actually want lives in the refrigerated section, or better, in your own mason jar. Pack shredded cabbage tightly with 1 to 2 teaspoons of non-iodized salt per pound of cabbage. Press it down until the brine rises above the vegetable. Cover loosely. Keep it at room temperature for 5 to 7 days. When it smells sour and bubbles slightly when you open it, it is alive. Eat 2 to 4 tablespoons with meals daily. And do not under any circumstances throw away the brine. The liquid in the jar is as medically active as the cabbage itself. The German sailors did not know about lactobacillus. They did not need to. They had barrel after barrel of evidence that the men who ate it lived. The research is now explaining why. Number 14. Kimchi, the immune army in a clay pot. The book of Proverbs, chapter 27, notes that the full soul loathes the honeycomb, but to the hungry soul, every bitter thing is sweet. Traditional Korean cuisine understood this truth in a very specific way. Kimchi, fermented cabbage and radish with chili, garlic, ginger, and traditionally fish sauce, is not a comfortable food in the Western sense. It is assertive, pungent, deeply flavored, and slightly challenging. It was never designed to be comfortable. It was designed to be functional. Korean culinary tradition stretching back over 2,000 years produced dozens of kimchi varieties maintained simultaneously in clay pots called ongi, buried in the ground to maintain a stable, cool temperature. Diversity of kimchi varieties was considered as important as the kimchi itself. That diversity strategy, it turns out, has a precise scientific explanation. Kimchi produces a diversity of lactobacillus strains, most notably Lactobacillus kimchi, a strain not commonly found in other fermented foods. Studies have documented kimchi's effects on immune modulation, cholesterol reduction, insulin sensitivity, and inflammatory cytokine levels. But here is what most wellness sources leave out. The garlic in kimchi is not just flavor. It contributes fructooligosaccharides, prebiotic fibers that specifically feed the probiotic bacteria you are simultaneously delivering. Kimchi does not just deposit beneficial bacteria in your gut. It sends them in with a food supply. The chili's capsaicin compounds add direct anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties. The ginger contributes gingerols and shogaols with studied anti-nausea and circulation-supporting effects. This is a synergistic food system built over millennia of careful observation. Eat a few tablespoons with every meal. In traditional Korean households, multiple varieties were always on the table simultaneously. That variety, researchers now understand, maps to greater diversity of microbial cultures reaching the gut. And microbiome diversity is one of the most consistent markers of long-term health outcomes in the current literature. Number 13. Kefir, the ancient drink that outperforms yogurt. The pastoral world of the Old Testament, Abraham's tent in Genesis 18, the feast described in Samuel and Chronicles, the milk and honey promised in Exodus, was a world built around fermented dairy. Milk in the ancient Near East was never consumed fresh the way we think of it today. Without refrigeration, fresh milk fermented within hours. What the ancients drank, what they gave their children, what they offered to guests of honor was fermented milk, culture-rich, enzyme-alive, probiotic-dense. What developed in the Caucasus Mountain region, the area stretching from modern Georgia and Armenia through Azerbaijan and into Turkey, was kefir. Made by culturing milk with kefir grains, symbiotic colonies of bacteria and yeast that look like small cauliflower florets, kefir produces a drink containing between 20 and 60 distinct probiotic strains. Compare that to commercial yogurt's 2 to 7 strains. This is not a marginal difference. It is a categorically different food. The Caucasian mountain peoples who maintained this tradition were, for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, among the longest-lived populations ever documented. Researchers who visited those communities noted lifespans routinely reaching 100 years and beyond, with physical function and cognitive clarity well into old age. Their diet was studied extensively. Kefir was a daily fixture without exception. Modern clinical trials confirm what those communities demonstrated empirically. Kefir has been shown to colonize the gut, meaning the strains it contains do not merely pass through. They establish residence and multiply. Studies confirm it reduces symptoms of lactose intolerance because the bacteria predigest the lactose during fermentation, making it accessible even for many people who cannot tolerate milk. Research published in peer-reviewed journals shows it improves IBS symptoms, reduces inflammatory markers, and demonstrates anti-tumor activity in animal models, with results researchers describe as worthy of continued investigation. Here is the preparation detail that most people overlook. Kefir grains are alive, genuinely living organisms that need care. They require whole unskimmed milk to maintain their full culture diversity over time. Low-fat milk can be used in a pinch, but the fat-soluble vitamins and the conjugated linoleic acid present in full-fat dairy contribute to the food's overall nutritional profile in ways that stripping the fat removes completely. Drink 1 cup daily. Real kefir, not the commercial stabilized yogurt drinks marketed under the same name on supermarket shelves. The real thing is thinner, slightly carbonated, and sour enough to make you pay attention to what you are drinking. If it tastes like a sweet dessert, it is not kefir in any traditional sense. Number 12. Kombucha, the living detox. Across the ancient world, fermented teas and fermented tonics appear repeatedly in medical and ceremonial contexts. In Proverbs 31, strong drink and wine are referenced as medicines given to the dying and the poor, not as moral failings, but as actual administered treatments. The concept of fermented beverages as medicine is woven through ancient texts with remarkable consistency. Kombucha, fermented sweet tea, transformed over 1 to 3 weeks by a SCOBY, a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, has a documented history extending across China, Russia, and Eastern Europe for more than 2,000 years. It entered the Western medical literature in the early 20th century when it was studied by German and Russian researchers investigating its effects on digestion and liver function. The fermentation produces organic acids, primarily acetic acid and glucuronic acid, that have documented liver-supportive and detoxification mechanisms. Glucuronic acid specifically binds to toxins and facilitates their elimination through the kidneys and bile, the biochemical scaffolding beneath the traditional claim that kombucha cleanses the body. There is real chemistry here. The research is still developing, and absolute claims about disease prevention would overstate what the current literature supports, but the mechanisms are documented and credible. Kombucha also contains B vitamins produced during fermentation and antioxidants from the tea polyphenols. Its probiotic content is lower than kefir or sauerkraut, but its organic acid profile gives it a distinct therapeutic role the others do not replicate. Look for raw, unpasteurized kombucha with live cultures listed and sugar content under 5 grams per serving. Drink 4 to 8 ounces before a meal as a digestive tonic, not as a daily soda replacement in unlimited quantities. Targeted, purposeful, small doses. Number 11. Traditional full-fat yogurt, the probiotic baseline. Here is a distinction that changes everything you think you know about yogurt. The yogurt the ancient world ate, strained, full-fat, made from whole milk, fermented for 12 to 24 hours, until the cultures genuinely proliferated, is fundamentally different from the fruit-flavored, low-fat, heat-treated product that fills most refrigerators today. They share a name. They do not share a function. Psalm 81 records God offering Israel the finest wheat and honey from the rock. The food culture surrounding that text, the pastoral economy of ancient Israel, the dairy practices of Mesopotamia and Egypt, the fermented milk products described in multiple ancient Near Eastern documents, was a culture in which fermented dairy was daily food, not a supplement, not a specialty item. Daily bread. Multiple civilizations, Greek, Middle Eastern, South Asian, and Central Asian, independently developed yogurt-style fermented dairy, each recognizing it as medicinal for the sick, restorative for the elderly, and foundational for general health. That pattern of independent convergence across completely separate cultures is itself evidence of something real. Randomized controlled trials on genuine cultured yogurt show it reduces the duration of infectious diarrhea, supports recovery after antibiotic use, and reduces the risk of antibiotic-associated infection by repopulating disrupted gut flora. Full-fat dairy fermented foods contain conjugated linoleic acid, a fatty acid with documented anti-inflammatory and body composition effects. Stripping the fat removes that compound entirely. The Greek and Middle Eastern practice of straining yogurt into labneh, a thick, concentrated form, increases protein and probiotic density per serving. Eat it with olive oil and herbs as it was meant to be eaten, not drowned in fruit syrup and granola. Number 10. Miso, the enzyme factory. Japan kept for 1,000 years. In the Book of Ezekiel, chapter 4, grain cakes and fermented preparations are described in a level of culinary detail unusual for Scripture, suggesting that fermented grain preparations were recognized as medicine, not merely food. The intersection of fermentation and grain is one of the oldest medical traditions in human history. Japan developed miso, soybeans fermented with rice or barley, in a mold called Aspergillus oryzae, over 1,000 years ago, and the practice never wavered. Daily miso soup at breakfast remains among the most consistent dietary habits in the population, with the world's longest documented life expectancy. When researchers began investigating why, they found something unexpected. Here is what most health sources omit. Long-aged miso, darker, richer, fermented for 2 to 3 years rather than weeks, contains dramatically higher concentrations of the bioactive compounds responsible for miso's documented health effects. The fermentation process transforms soybeans through enzymatic breakdown in ways that make them almost unrecognizable from the raw ingredient. What you get is a food extraordinarily rich in digestive enzymes and free amino acids. The fermentation also reduces the phytic acid in soybeans that otherwise blocks mineral absorption, a mechanism that explains why traditional Asian cultures eating soy daily did not develop the mineral deficiencies that some research has linked to unfermented soy consumption in Western diets. Studies show miso specifically, not unfermented soy, reduces inflammatory markers, supports beneficial gut bacteria, and may have protective effects on the stomach lining, with results researchers describe as consistent enough to sustain continued investigation. The preparation detail that has mattered for 1,000 years and that traditional Japanese cooks never violated. Dissolve it into hot but not boiling liquid, approximately 1 teaspoon per cup of warm broth. That specific instruction appears in Japanese culinary texts going back centuries. They followed it before anyone understood the biochemistry behind it. Number 9. Raw aged cheese, the forgotten probiotic. The Book of Samuel records that David was brought cheese of Kline, likely a hard-aged form of fermented dairy, as provision during a military campaign. Hard-aged cheese in the ancient world was not a delicacy. It was a preserved, concentrated food source for people who needed caloric density and stability. What the ancient world preserved was alive. Aged raw milk cheeses, traditional Parmigiano Reggiano, raw milk cheddar, aged Gouda, Roquefort, Manchego, contain active bacterial cultures that survive in the cheese matrix and reach the gut intact. This is a fact that decades of industrial dairy processing and pasteurization requirements have almost entirely obscured. Studies on aged raw cheeses show they contain lactobacillus, bifidobacterium, and other beneficial species in meaningful counts. But here is what most sources omit entirely. The aging process produces short-chain fatty acids that directly feed colonocytes, the cells lining your colon, and support intestinal integrity in ways that even other fermented foods do not. Aged cheese is also one of the richest dietary sources of vitamin K2 in the menaquinone 7 form, the most bioavailable variety, which directs calcium into bones. K2 deficiency has been implicated in arterial calcification, osteoporosis, and cardiovascular disease. A modest portion of real aged raw milk cheese addresses this in a way that no supplement fully replicates, 1 ounce or 2 as part of a meal, the way Europeans ate it for centuries. A condiment, not a centerpiece. The dose is small. The impact, according to researchers studying K2 and cardiovascular health, is real. Number 8. Sourdough bread, the ancient loaf that digests itself. And here we arrive at the story I promised you at the beginning. Stay with me, because this one is worth slowing down for. In 1 Kings chapter 19, the prophet Elijah collapses under a broom tree in the Negev desert. He has been running for his life. He has gone a day's journey into the wilderness. He lies down and asks to die. He has, by the text's account, not eaten in what appears to be an extended period. His body is in a state that modern medicine would recognize as starvation, dehydration, and acute psychological crisis simultaneously. An angel appears twice. Each time it touches him and says, "Arise and eat." And what is waiting for him both times, twice in the same narrative, described with unusual specificity for scripture, is a cake baked on coals and a cruse of water. A baked grain cake, warm bread, water. That is not just poetry. In modern physiological terms, that is a precise description of cellular restoration. A body depleted of glycogen, electrolytes, and energy substrate, being given the exact 2 things it needs: complex fermented grain carbohydrates. The text records that after eating twice, he rose and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights. 40 days on the strength of bread and water. Real sourdough, not the bakery versions that use commercial yeast, not the loaves made in 2 hours, is bread leavened exclusively by wild yeast and lactobacillus bacteria, fermented for a minimum of 8 to 12 hours, and often 24 to 48. During that long fermentation, the lactobacillus bacteria consume the sugars that would otherwise spike blood glucose. They produce acids that lower the bread's pH and break down phytic acid, the anti-nutrient in wheat that blocks absorption of zinc, iron, and magnesium. They partially digest the gluten proteins, making them structurally different and significantly more manageable for the digestive system. Studies comparing real long-fermented sourdough to conventional bread show meaningfully lower glycemic responses, better mineral absorption, and improved digestibility, even in people who normally react to wheat. Some individuals with non-celiac gluten sensitivity tolerate long-fermented sourdough without the symptoms they experience with standard bread, a finding researchers describe as promising and worth further investigation. The bread Elijah ate was almost certainly something close to this. Dense whole grain, slow-made, kept alive by the microbes in the grain itself. Make it at home if you can. Whole grain flour, a maintained sourdough starter, and 12 to 24 hours. No shortcuts. The fermentation is the medicine. The industrial loaf sold in a plastic bag with a 3-week shelf life is not bread in any ancestral sense. It shares a shape with bread. That is approximately where the resemblance ends. If this kind of ancient knowledge resonates with you, hit like and subscribe, because what is coming next goes even deeper. Number 7. Kvass, the blood tonic. Most people have never heard of. The prophet Ezekiel was instructed to drink measured water and eat measured bread during a period of symbolic prophecy. Water regulation, blood purity, and what entered the body were treated with profound seriousness throughout Hebrew scripture. The medicinal role of specific fermented beverages in ceremonial and medical contexts spans virtually every ancient culture, and Kvass is one of the most potent examples that the Western world has almost entirely forgotten. Kvass is a traditional Eastern European fermented beverage used medically across Russia, Ukraine, and Poland for centuries. Bread Kvass, the original, is a low-alcohol probiotic drink produced by fermenting rye bread crusts in water. Beet Kvass is what the medical literature finds more interesting. Fermented raw beets in salted water, traditionally used across Eastern European folk medicine for liver conditions, sluggish digestion, and anemia. Here is the compound-level detail that most sources miss. The fermentation of beets concentrates their betalin content, the red pigments in beets with documented antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects, while simultaneously enhancing the bioavailability of dietary nitrates. The body converts these nitrates through a pathway involving oral bacteria into nitric oxide. Nitric oxide dilates blood vessels, improves circulation, and reduces blood pressure. Randomized controlled trials on beetroot consumption have shown genuine reductions in systolic blood pressure of 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury, a magnitude researchers describe as comparable to certain pharmaceutical interventions, though with a very different mechanism and safety profile. The lacto-fermentation adds lactobacillus strains and increases the bioavailability of iron and folate in the beet, making beet kvass particularly relevant for individuals with iron deficiency, a condition the Eastern European herbalists who relied on it had identified empirically long before iron metabolism was understood. 4 ounces before meals. It is earthy, slightly sour, deeply mineral, and an acquired taste. Most people who stay with it for 2 weeks stop noticing the taste and start noticing the shift in how they feel. Number 6. Fermented hot sauce, the metabolic fire. Pepper cultivation in the ancient world appears across Mesoamerican, African, and Asian traditional medicine, with a consistency that suggests independent discovery of the same biological truth. Capsaicin-rich preparations appear in Aztec medicine, in Ayurvedic practice, in traditional West African herbalism. The recognition that hot peppers did something fundamentally different to the body than other foods was not one culture's insight. It was nearly universal. Fermented hot sauce, made by lacto-fermenting fresh hot peppers with salt over 3 to 7 days before blending, is a different product than commercial hot sauce made with distilled vinegar. Meaningfully different. The fermentation produces live lactobacillus cultures while simultaneously concentrating capsaicin. Capsaicin binds to TRPV1 receptors in the gut lining, triggering a cascade of effects. Studies show capsaicin elevates metabolic rate for up to several hours after consumption, a result that has been replicated across multiple clinical trials. It stimulates digestive enzyme secretion, modulates appetite through effects on ghrelin and satiety signaling, and shows direct antimicrobial activity against H. pylori, one of the most common drivers of gastric ulcers, a finding with significant practical implications for anyone who has ever had persistent stomach discomfort. There is an additional layer that most sources omit entirely. Recent research has identified a specific interaction between capsaicin and short-chain fatty acid production in the gut. Fermented pepper preparations appear to stimulate butyrate-producing bacteria, and butyrate is among the most studied and protective compounds in gut health, with research linking it to colon cancer prevention, intestinal barrier integrity, and anti-inflammatory effects. The research is still developing, but the direction is consistent enough to be worth noting. A tablespoon or 2 on food with every meal. Traditional Mexican, Korean, and West African cuisines all feature fermented pepper preparations. These were not accidents of flavor. They were functional foods built into cultural habit over generations. Number 5. Fermented garlic and honey, the immune legend. In Sirach, one of the deuterocanonical books recognized as scripture by Catholic and Orthodox traditions, and as historical wisdom literature more broadly. It is written that the Lord created medicines out of the earth, and he that is wise will not abhor them. Honey and garlic both appear separately throughout ancient medical and sacred texts, with a frequency that suggests their value was not theoretical. They were used daily by people who needed them to work. What happens when you ferment them together is something the ancient herbalists who practiced this across both Asian and European traditions understood empirically. What we now understand biochemically is this: the enzymatic environment of raw honey, with its hydrogen peroxide producing glucose oxidase, its low water activity, its antimicrobial peptide content, creates conditions that transform raw garlic over a period of 4 to 8 weeks. Allicin, the primary active compound in garlic, becomes more stable and more bioavailable through this process. The antimicrobial compounds in the honey become more concentrated, and the naturally occurring microbiota present on both the garlic and the raw honey initiate a slow fermentation that produces additional bioactive compounds. Clinical research on garlic shows it reduces the frequency of colds and upper respiratory infections, lowers blood pressure, reduces LDL cholesterol, and has broad-spectrum antimicrobial activity against pathogens, including some antibiotic-resistant strains, with results consistent enough to sustain continued investigation. Research on raw honey confirms antibacterial effects, antiviral properties, and wound healing acceleration. Here is the practical detail that most people get wrong when attempting this preparation. The garlic must be raw and freshly peeled, not pre-minced, not jarred. The honey must be raw and unfiltered, still containing the live enzymes and the pollen. Pasteurized honey will not ferment in the same way. Submerge whole, peeled cloves in raw honey in a clean jar. Leave it at room temperature for 4 to 8 weeks, burping the lid every few days. The cloves will sink, then mellow in flavor, eventually becoming spreadable and almost sweet. The honey becomes deeply infused with garlic's active compounds. 1 to 3 cloves daily during cold and flu season. More at the onset of illness. This is the kind of preparation that existed in every traditional household medicine chest before we decided medicine came in blister packs. Number 4. Apple cider vinegar with the mother, the blood sugar regulator. Vinegar appears in scripture in 2 contexts that are often missed in casual reading. In Ruth 2 verse 14, Boaz invites Ruth to come and eat of the bread and dip thy morsel in the vinegar, a meal offer. In Numbers 6, the Nazirite vow prohibits the consumption of wine vinegar, implying that fermented vinegar was an ordinary table presence. Vinegar was food, medicine, a daily presence at the ancient table. Real apple cider vinegar with the mother is the endpoint of a double fermentation. Apples ferment first to hard cider, then a second fermentation converts the alcohol to acetic acid. The mother, the colony of bacteria responsible for that second fermentation, remains visible as a cloudy, stringy mass at the bottom of the bottle when it has not been filtered and pasteurized away. Multiple controlled clinical trials have shown that consuming 1 to 2 tablespoons before a high-carbohydrate meal reduces post-meal blood glucose spikes by 15 to 30%. The mechanism is well documented. Acetic acid inhibits the enzyme alpha amylase, which breaks starch into glucose, essentially slowing the carbohydrate. For anyone managing blood sugar, and given the current metabolic health landscape that is most people, studies also show improvements in insulin sensitivity over time with regular use, reductions in fasting glucose, and meaningful effects on triglyceride levels. Here is the additional mechanism that rarely gets discussed. Apple cider vinegar stimulates gastric acid production in people with hypochlorhydria, low stomach acid, a condition researchers estimate affects a significant percentage of adults over 60, and that is profoundly underdiagnosed. Low stomach acid drives chronic bloating, inadequate protein digestion, mineral malabsorption, and pathogen susceptibility. Addressing it with 1 tablespoon of diluted apple cider vinegar before meals can resolve symptoms. 1 tablespoon in 8 ounces of water, 15 minutes before meals. Never undiluted. The acidity damages tooth enamel and the esophageal lining over time. Diluted, it is among the most evidence-supported and inexpensive interventions in this entire list. Number 3. Natto, the most underrated cardiovascular food on earth. The concept of foods that thin the blood, support circulation, and protect the heart appears repeatedly through the ancient medical literature of Asia, in the writings of traditional Chinese medicine, in early Japanese medicinal texts, in Ayurvedic practice. The idea that fermented soybean preparations had specific cardiovascular effects was part of traditional Japanese medical practice long before anyone isolated the compound responsible. Natto, fermented soybeans made with Bacillus subtilis, produces a compound called nattokinase. This enzyme, found nowhere else in the food supply, has been shown in clinical trials to dissolve fibrin, the protein that forms blood clots, with a mechanism that researchers have compared favorably to pharmaceutical thrombolytics in terms of cardiovascular protection. It directly reduces the risk of thrombosis, lowers blood viscosity, and acts through a pathway distinct from common anticoagulant medications with a safety profile researchers describe as significantly different from pharmaceutical alternatives. For anyone concerned about cardiovascular risk, these findings are among the most clinically significant in all of fermented food research. The science is still developing, but the direction and consistency of results have attracted serious academic attention. Here is the specific detail most sources omit. Natto-kinase activity is heat sensitive. Commercial natto supplements are processed at temperatures that researchers have found significantly reduce enzymatic activity. The only way to guarantee you are getting biologically active natto-kinase is through the food itself, eaten at or below body temperature. Do not heat natto. Eat it cold or at room temperature, traditionally over warm rice, where the heat of the rice does not directly contact or denature the enzyme. Natto is also the single richest dietary source of vitamin K2 in the MK7 form. A single serving provides over 300 micrograms compared to the 30 to 50 micrograms most researchers recommend. K2 directs calcium out of arteries and into bones. Its deficiency has been implicated in arterial calcification and osteoporosis. Natto takes care of both simultaneously. The flavor and texture are genuinely challenging for those encountering it for the first time. Stringy, pungent, and assertively fermented. Traditional Japanese breakfast culture treats it as unremarkable, which is its own form of evidence. 50 to 100 grams served over rice several times per week. Number 2. Fermented beetroot, the circulation supercharger. Isaiah 40, verse 31, contains a promise that has resonated across generations. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. Whatever the spiritual application of that passage, there is a physiological reality underneath it that fermented beetroot addresses in a remarkably direct way. The nitrates in beets, concentrated further through lacto-fermentation, are converted by oral bacteria into nitric oxide, the molecule responsible for vasodilation, improved oxygen delivery to muscles, and enhanced cardiovascular endurance. Randomized controlled trials on beetroot consumption have shown genuine improvements in time to physical exhaustion, better oxygen efficiency, and faster recovery. Results robust enough that beetroot preparations are now restricted by some elite sports regulatory bodies, which is an unusual form of confirmation about the potency of a vegetable. Here is the preparation detail that most sources, even serious ones, get wrong. Raw fermented beets retain dramatically higher levels of active betalains and bioaccessible nitrates. Heat degrades both compounds significantly. The traditional preparation across Eastern European folk medicine, raw beets, filtered water, a small amount of non-iodized salt, a few days at room temperature, is not only the simplest method, but the medically superior one. No cooking, no boiling. The brine that results after 3 to 5 days of fermentation is the most concentrated form of the food's active compounds. 3 to 4 ounces of that brine daily before physical activity or as a morning tonic. The fermentation adds lactobacillus probiotic cultures and increases bioavailability of iron and folate within the beet itself, making fermented beets particularly useful for anyone dealing with iron deficiency fatigue or inadequate folate intake, which in adults over 50 is more common than most people realize. The color will alarm you. It will turn your urine and occasionally your stool a deep pink red. That is the betalains being processed. That is not a problem. That is the food working. Number 1. Raw, unpasteurized, lacto-fermented vegetables. The foundation that was always there. Most people reading this, most people watching this, have had something in their kitchen at some point in their lives that fits this category. A jar of pickles, a container of sauerkraut, something their grandmother made that sat in the back of the refrigerator and smelled sharp and sour and alive. And they used it as a condiment, maybe, or ignored it, or threw it away when they moved. The lacto-fermented vegetable, cucumber, carrot, radish, turnip, green bean, cauliflower, any vegetable preserved in salted brine through natural lactobacillus fermentation is perhaps the most ancient prepared food in human history. It appears in virtually every culture that ever existed under different names, with different spices, with different vegetables, but with the same fundamental mechanism: salt, water, time, and the intelligence of the microbial world. The distinction that determines whether these foods do anything for your health is this: was vinegar added, or did the acidity develop through live fermentation? Virtually every pickle in a standard grocery store aisle uses distilled white vinegar. It is not a fermented food. It is an acidified food. No bacteria were involved. No bacteria survived. It is shelf-stable, predictable, and medically inert. Real lacto-fermented pickles are made with cucumbers, filtered water, non-iodized salt, and whatever spices are preferred by tradition. The salt creates an environment where lactobacillus bacteria naturally present on the cucumber skin can thrive, produce lactic acid, and preserve the vegetable through genuine biological transformation. These pickles live in the refrigerator because they are still active. They smell alive because they genuinely are. Studies on lacto-fermented vegetables show they increase the density and diversity of beneficial gut bacteria, contain meaningful amounts of vitamin C and B vitamins produced during fermentation, and deliver organic acids that shift the gut environment in favor of beneficial bacteria. The brine, the liquid they sit in, is medically active and should never be discarded. Athletes have used pickle brine for rapid muscle cramp relief, a phenomenon that researchers have now linked to a neural reflex triggered by the acidic compounds, not simply hydration.